Hi everyone, and welcome to the Introduction to Coastal Imaging, the CIRN at the CIRN boot camp. My name is Rob Holman. For the past 40 years, I've worked at Oregon State University in the Coastal Imaging Lab, where a lot of the methods that we'll introduce to you in this boot camp have been developed before they started to spread out around the world. Since this is an introduction, we're going to start with discussion about the nature of the nearshore problem. So what is the science that we're trying to do? And that'll lead us into how do we sample the processes and phenomena. We'll talk about in situ sampling first, the traditional methods, and then the role that can be played by coastal imaging of various flavors that helps supplement that original imaging. That'll lead us to a future look of where's nearshore capability ultimately going, and it'll get us into the world of operational nearshore prediction and how that can depend on coastal imaging and also. Finally, we'll talk about the various components of the boot camp, so the tools that you'll have to learn as you develop skills in photogrammetry and the steps that you'll end up taking, and then a little bit about CIRN itself, the Coastal Imaging Research Network, which is the group of volunteers who are helping put this whole thing together, and which you are welcome to now join. So the nature of the nearshore problem. This is Black's Beach in Southern California. It's a bit north of San Diego and La Jolla, and it's been the site of a number of important field experiments. But we can use it just to talk about what we're trying to understand. On the left is the ocean, of course. And the waves come in from the deep ocean, and they start to feel the bottom bathymetry, and that changes their dynamics. So you can see the waves start to peak up and then eventually break in a surf zone and drive currents and infragravity waves and other types of motion, cell circulation. This is often thought of as the physical oceanography problem of waves propagating over a sloping bathymetry. But the bathymetry and the underlying boundary is actually made up of erodible sediments, usually sand, that in turn responds to these overlying motions and so changes through sediment transport, developing sandbars and a whole set of interesting morphology. And that can individually be thought of as the marine geology problem, but in fact, the nearshore has to study them both because the one feeds into the other and vice versa. So there's a feedback loop that leads to very rich morphodynamics. In 1989, the nearshore community got together in St. Petersburg, Florida for a first community meeting to try to understand all the various components of the research that people were carrying out and how they fit together, and then what the priorities should be for the next 10 or 20 years. Some of the outcomes that came out of this meeting were figures like the two shown here that are conceptual diagrams of how the nearshore works. So the upper panel shows a schematic that I was just trying to describe. We have a bathymetry, which is shown in the tan colored, going from deeper water. So H is depth, function of X. Going from deeper water to the shoreline with a sandbar shown in the middle. The blue illustrates the wave energy, which starts as an input spectrum, starts to feel the bottom, and then goes through physical oceanography to become a very transformed spectrum on the right, or in shallow water with currents and other motions. Those motions in turn change the bottom boundaries, say, the bottom boundary, so the bathymetry. And so that's shown with the dashed line, which has changed some amount over some time scale, and the time scales could be hours for the foreshore or days or more for sandbars. A even more abstract organization chart of these phenomena are shown in the bottom chart, the bottom panel, where on the left we have the input spectrum in blue, which drives the whole system. The waves propagate over the bottom boundary condition, H of X, which is the tan box, and go through a bunch of fluid dynamics to become a transformed spectrum, so the physical oceanography problem. In turn, all of those motions drive sediment transport, the dashed black box and line, which change the bathymetry, which changes the fluid dynamics. So that's the marine geology problem, but there's a feedback loop that's clear in that box that goes around and round and leads to some of the interesting morphodynamics. So one of the outputs of this 1989 meeting was a statement of our goals for nearshore processes research that's shown on the upper right. And that's to develop a predictive understanding of waves and currents as they shoal over a sloping bottom, and in turn, the response of the bottom to those fluid motions. This is science, so we need to be able to measure and monitor all of these processes and the different variables. And that's where the role of coastal imaging will come in. So what are the scales that we need to sample at? Well, it turns out that there are phenomena that span all scales in both space and time, and in hydrodynamics and morphodynamics. So on the left is the hydrodynamics, and you can see phenomena range from turbulence to swash, waves, currents, rip channels, etc., up to larger scales. And then the morphological phenomenon can start at ripples through beach cuffs, beaches, shorelines, cell circulation, etc. So we have to sample at a wide range of scales in both space and time, and that raises sampling challenges. Now, traditionally, when I was a graduate student, for example, we did sampling with in situ instrumentation. So on the right are some in situ samplers that have been used quite a lot to measure pressure sensors, to measure the wave heights, current meters to measure wave velocities, and even sediment measuring instrumentation. And these are isolated instruments that have to be installed in situ by hand and sample very accurately, or quite accurately, the phenomena that they're looking for, but they do it only at single points, or if you put out a bunch of these instruments at arrays of points, but not densely sampled. Similarly, for surveys, to try to measure the bathymetry, we have some devices on the left which have been used, which replace the old stadia rod and old leveling techniques with GPS sensors and potentially fathometers. So all of these measurements, traditional measurements, are highly accurate. Their phenomenologies, their physics is well known, but they're very expensive. The logistics are difficult, it's time consuming, and it's usually resolution limited, both in time and space. One other limitation I have to mention, because it's close to my heart, is for in situ instruments, the nearshore is a hostile environment. I did my grad school on the east coast of Canada and used in situ instruments, and then got a job in Oregon in 1979, went to the beach in the winter and looked out at a typical wave height of, the average wave height is 3 meters in the winter, and decided that in situ instruments were to get me killed, and so that I needed to develop some alternate ways of sampling that were safer. And that leads to the idea of coastal imaging. Cameras provide a rich source of information about the nearshore that we can have a hypothesis that we can use that information to quantify the important nearshore variables, and we can probably do this over long time scales and large spatial scales, and even do it remotely, so we don't even need to have to be there. So these snapshots are oblique images. These are from Duck, North Carolina, and they show the current 6 cameras that cover the field of view, 180-degree field of view from the north on the left, through offshore in the middle and the pier. You can see the FRF research pier, to the south on the right. And these are full of signatures that we would like to be able to exploit. So in order to do exploitation of coastal imaging, we will require 2 skills, and you'll learn these in the boot camp. The first one, and the one you'll focus mostly on, is photogrammetry. So oblique images are measured in pixels, and they're just images, but they are not in geographical coordinates. We need to use photogrammetry in order to transform those into geographical coordinates, like in the bottom figure, where the units are now meters, and we can actually measure scales of anything that we can see. You'll learn how to do this through photogrammetry, and this example is a snap image. It's the process of mapping it to world coordinates is called rectification. And because the information comes from 6 different cameras and makes a single view here, we call it a merged rectified view. These images are full of signatures that we would like to exploit. So on the left, you can see an arrow pointing to the shoreline. It's visible. We should be able to exploit that. We don't often have to measure where a pier is, but if we did, there it is. And then we can obviously see waves quite clearly, and particularly breaking waves. So we can make measurements about things to do with waves and breaking waves. So how does this work for a new type of experiment involving coastal imaging? This is an example experiment from New Smyrna Beach, Florida, which was carried out by the FRF people plus a number of other collaborators in 2017-2018. The upper panel shows a map of the area. It's a large area. It's about 8 kilometers long in the alongshore and 2 kilometers in the cross-shore. And the idea was to install an offshore beach nourishment and then look at the impact of that nourishment on nearshore hydrodynamics and on the nearshore coastal response. So the change of the shoreline and nearshore morphology, or nearshore sandbar systems. This was done over an extended length of time. So if you look at the bottom panel, it shows the wave height that was driving this area over 7 months. And the nourishment itself took about 5 months. You can see the line marking at the time of nourishment. So the idea was to take this perturbation experiment of this large nourishment and understand the impact on hydrodynamics and beach morphology. There was an in situ component of this experiment. So the 3 red dots in the upper panel show 3 sampled locations which were looking at the changing hydrodynamics caused by the nourishment. And in the lower panel, the tan colored area shows the time over which was roughly a month, over which the sampling was taken. The change of the bathymetry, or nearshore morphology, was measured by in situ survey instruments. So the dashed line in the upper panel shows the sampling pattern to do a nearshore survey. And these were done just twice, once at the beginning. If you look at the lower panel on the left, the vertical green bar was the initial survey, and then 6 months later, a final survey in February. So the in situ sampling was very limited in spatial resolution and in temporal resolution. The survey results, for example, only show a before and after result. But if you look at the wave height curve time series, you'll see there's a series of storms that come through up to more than 4 meters wave height. And it's presumably these have a large impact on the effect on the overall nourishment and on the shoreline response. And with such limited sampling of the bathymetry, it's hard to isolate those important driving events from just a long-term seasonal trend. So that would be a goal of coastal imaging. So also part of this experiment was the installation of a mini Argus camera at the middle of the domain on the beach. And in fact, you can see that what was called a map previously is in fact just a merged rectified time exposure view from the 4 cameras. And you can actually roughly see the boundaries between the cameras if you look carefully. So These cameras monitored for the 7 months shown, plus in fact a lot longer, and greatly helped increase the resolution in space and time of the sampling. So the upper panel, it's clear that with these 4 cameras in one station, you're sampling now an 8 kilometer by 2 kilometer region with pretty high spatial resolution. And in the lower panel shows the temporal resolution of sampling, not quite accurately in that we don't sample at night, but we do sample every hour over the entire time. Because we've got so many samples, we can show movies of daily response of the beach. So you can see the nourishment around y equals 500 as it's been installed and affects the wave breaking patterns. Then you can see the shoreline response and the response of the nearshore sandbar morphology to this nourishment as this all evolves through time. So the coastal imaging greatly increases the spatial resolution and extent of sampling. It adds high frequency observations, in this case hourly observations during daytime hours. There are some limitations. Coastal imaging only sees the surface of the water. However, that's often very representative of what's happening in the domain. And it's unclear how some of these surface signatures reflect geophysical variables that we would like to be able to sample. And that gets us into these algorithms and how well algorithms can convert between optical signals and geophysical variables. But there's no question that coastal imaging can be a powerful supplement to traditional monitoring techniques. That takes us to the future. We're developing all this new knowledge and capability because society needs it. So we would like to be able to produce operational predictions of importance engineering quantities. So ideally, we'd like to have a capability to produce maps like the one on the right. And the color in this map is bathymetry, is depth. So red is deep on the right, blue is ironically shallow on the left. And the plot is overlain by a set of black vectors which indicate the current generally going from north to south, but with a gyre in the middle. Now, I don't know why you would particularly want this product, but you can imagine it's representative of any coastal prediction that coastal engineers or coastal zone managers would need. Now, to make these predictions, we developed a lot of knowledge of the physics and implementation through numerical models. That's shown in the blue oval in the middle, represented by F equals ma for the physics, and then implementations of various example models like Delft 3D, XBeach, etc. And these produce the plots that we need on the right. But they only do so if you give them input data for the forcing. So that includes the wave forcing, and this plot shows a directional wave spectrum and frequency and wave direction, which changes slowly in time. And you also need to know the bathymetry, which is the bottom boundary condition for all the physics. So we have invested a lot of time and decades and money in trying to develop these prediction tools and test them. We have done this in large field experiments where we try hard to produce inputs that are essentially perfect information, perfect inputs to the model, and then test how well the model works. So that means carefully surveyed bathymetry over the entire domain with no error or as close as possible, and then carefully measured wave forcing over the boundary conditions. And we would do that with a set of in situ instruments and large experiments with lots of instruments and people. And when you do that, and then you make predictions using the numerical models and compare them to measurements of the actual predicted quantities like currents or wave heights, we find that these models actually work quite well, very well, in fact. And so we're much encouraged by what we've learned. Now, the problem is to do these experiments cost a lot of money. And if the goal is to make practical prediction systems, nearshore prediction systems that can be used anywhere that people have coastal engineering problems, we can't afford to have large in situ instrumentation. So the hypothesis is that we can replace much of that instrumentation with remote sensing sensors, like the cameras illustrated on the left, and radar also illustrated, and LiDAR, and whatever we have. And instead of getting near perfect data, we're going to get more approximate data because they aren't quite as good as the survey instruments or the wave sensors. But the question is, are those inputs that are provided approximately by remote sensing good enough for the numerical models to produce adequate predictions for whatever we need to do for society? And that's our goal and our hypothesis and our reason for studying coastal imaging. So in summary, we're trying to understand the coastal problem. It's a complicated region. It has large gradients and variability in the cross shore, in the longshore, sometimes bizarre morphology. In situ measurements and models are good, but they don't handle the whole problem. And they won't be the tools that we can use as we try to apply these methods for a variety of nearshore coastal engineering problems. And the idea is that coastal imaging will then provide that additional information. Last line says CIRN tools will help. So we have come together to provide a bunch of toolboxes that anybody can use. And so we will talk about that now, and that'll be what you're learning in the boot camp. So the goal of the boot camp is to learn how you can use cameras to quantify coastal processes and measure variables that are seen with optical or infrared band cameras. To do that, we're going to need to understand a lot about cameras and basic photogrammetry. And so that's the principal focus of the early part of the boot camp. We have developed a repository of tools that anybody can use. These have been developed for two configurations. One is if you're using a drone or a hovering UAS, unmanned aerial system camera, and want to use the photogrammetry of that situation, or the alternate complementary situation is if you have fixed cameras, perhaps multiple cameras on a fixed tower or lighthouse or whatever. This shows the general steps that you're going to be learning about and a set of practical exercises that you will have to go through. On the left figure, there are 5 white boxes which talk about the main components that you have to go through. The first one is called pre-processing, the top box. And that's the process of taking video and extracting the frames that you'll need to do your photogrammetry on. The second box is called camera calibration, and that's at the heart of the photogrammetry to convert from pixels into world coordinates. The third box is then domain definition. So having now determined how the cameras work, you need to define a region of interest that you're going to process to. The fourth box is specific to drones, which approximately point in a constant direction, but actually move a little bit. And if you are using drone data and you need to correct out that slight motion to make it look like a fixed camera on a tower, then these will be the tools that you will use for that. And then the final box is called rectification product. So it's how to transform things into map views, and then eventually use extraction algorithms to come up with geophysical variables that you were really after. There are also several toolboxes shown in the tan-colored boxes, which are core functions on the left, which are used buy all of the photogrammetry tools. And then there was demo data for both drones and for fixed cameras that you can use to test out the different steps in the process. As you go through this, each step saves the intermediate results so you can stop and restart without having to restart the whole process. And there is copious amount of documentation in the whole thing. At the top, you can see the GitHub website where all of this stuff is located. This is open source and community driven, so you're welcome to it. Finally, just a few words on the Coastal Imaging Research Network, or CIRN. This is a grassroots effort, so a bunch of us just got together, and we're all volunteers. It's not funded. Our goal is to increase the growth, visibility, and knowledge of the coastal imaging community. So the idea is that the rising tide will float all boats. It's distributed, so we each do bits of work, and we expect new people to join and to help. And we want to foster collaboration and share resources and learning opportunities. So that's the introduction. From now on, we'll move into the guts of photogrammetry, and I hope you enjoy it and become fabulously productive as coastal imagers. Thank you.